So who are the players in this story? There's Maggie right here. And I am Bruce, and of course, our dog, Emmy. We were living in 2020 around March, and we started to get sad, and I saw a couple of faces scrunch up, so you kind of get where I'm coming from. But I mean, I've written all these books, I had all these accomplishments in the IT profession, but I was sad, I was detached. I'm an energy speaker, I'm an energy teacher, and I was isolated because when this COVID thing came, they would occasionally throw up this chart. And this chart is basically the types of people who die of COVID. And if you look at all the ones on the top, all the ones by cancer, I had all these things, right? So I was accumulating this kind of unhealthy feeling, was kind of fading into these dark clouds of depression. And what I've always done in my life before this time is I'd always lean on my wife Maggie, but she was depressed too. In this profession, we all kind of felt it, right? We were all kind of alone. And we got mad at each other, and some of that was happening in my professional life, some of that was happening in my personal life. There were relationships falling apart. We were sad. So I came down the stairs in my house, and Maggie was reading this book called From What Is to What If. And she was about as hopeful as I'd seen her for months and months and months. So this is a book doesn't have anything to do with programming languages. It has everything to do with reimagining your circumstance and kind of thinking about what you want out of life and imagining things as if they had already happened, and then say what things must be true to make it happen, to make it that way. So I don't know if you're kind of seeing the storm clouds parting, but I was. And then 2 weeks later, I was coming down the stairs and Maggie's sitting right down there. And I could see the book that she's reading. It was called The Great Loop Experience. And I just about fell down the stairs the rest of the way. Because this book is about an audacious trip, right? And so Maggie is not an adventure seeker. She's a planner. She's a thinker. And when she buys a book like this, something big is about to happen. And it was. So this is the Great Loop. You get your own boat. And we're not boat people, but you get your own boat. For us, that meant we were going to start in Chattanooga. We're going to go down to the Tennessee River, all the way to this place called the 10-Ton Waterway, which is a canal so long and so big that you could see it from space. Go down to the Gulf of Mexico, take a left, down to Florida, cut across there, cut around the Keys, come all the way up the seaboard, in through New York, cut across Canada at these points, through the Great Lakes, in through Chicago, down the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, the Illinois River, and home. So we found this boat. This is called a Ranger tug. And this Ranger tug is kind of a smallish boat that you're going to take a big trip like this in. But I love this picture because this marks us as complete noobs, right? So if you're a good boater, you don't leave these fenders out when you're underway. And when you're a snobby boater, all these things match, right? But this is us as we're training for the trip. And we found this thing not in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where there aren't many ocean-going boats. We found this in Cape Coral, Florida. And looking around, I could see that I'm home. I'm from the South, from Memphis originally, moved to Texas, and then we wound up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. But we have people around us called Bubbas. right? Happy Bubbas. So I consider myself a happy Bubba. And we found this boat, we kind of looked it over, we had put down a down payment on this boat before we ever even saw it or set foot on it. Because you had to, because this was, a time of COVID when everybody was buying boats. But then we kind of went through this whirlwind process where we found ourselves kind of sitting, looking at the keel, saying, that doesn't look so good. Turns out that's supposed to corrode. That's called a sacrificial anode. Who knew? And then we found ourselves later sitting in this warehouse where they're about to put this thing on a trailer with a Bubba who's going to drive it across country, plop it in the water in Chattanooga, then he was going to leave. And I tell you, so they picked this thing up in the literal parking lot of this mall. They drove it in between all these Escalades and fancy cars. And I'm making all these noises. Currently, the boat was making even more noises. And they laid it on this trailer, and then somebody started screaming, and I don't think it was me. Maybe it was the trailer groaning, but everybody else was standing around, and the Bubba drove off. We jumped in a plane, and then we wound up in Chattanooga, or just west of Chattanooga. And there was this lift, and they unhooked all of the straps that were holding the boat down. They were driving around all these hills. The boat is rocking on the trailer, and everybody was standing around bored. And I didn't understand, right? Because something bad was about to happen. But anyway, they loaded it onto the lift picked it up, dropped it in the water, then everybody just went. And Maggie and I were sitting, not boat people, looking at this boat, saying, guess we're doing this, right? So the boat is pointing at the buildings and at the land, and it needs to be going the other way. We need to drive it out and then park it in our slip. And I can't even get it started, right? So I press the starter, it doesn't go. And so I said, okay, so I'll just, do my manly thing, and I'm not a very manly person. Walk down into the engine hatch, so I'll lift it up, kind of wrestle that up, and get down in the engine hatch, and then I just kind of start jiggling wires and stuff. And then I remember this article where I read that it said you need to prime it. So I just started pushing this button frantically, and then I said, try to start it, and I press it more, and then finally the thing starts up, right? And so I said, cast off, meaning before it dies again, right? So we cast off, and then Maggie, who normally has a frantic demeanor when something bad is about to happen, unless it's really bad, and then she gets ice cold calm. And she looked at me with this ice cold calm voice, and she said, "You're going to hit the dock." And then I said, I know I can see the dock, right? So I tried doing everything that it said in the manuals, tried all the things that I read on the internet. And she says, you're going to hit the dock. If you don't turn right now, you're going to hit the dock. And then, so we kissed the dock kissed back, left a little bit of lipstick, not too much. Good encounter, we're good, right? And then Maggie turns around and looks at me and says, you're going to hit the yacht. And then she said, you're going to hit the $20 million yacht. Here's 10 million max. And she said, if you don't turn right now, we're going to buy the $20 million yacht. And miraculously, I don't know how, the boat finally turned, and we wound up in the middle of the lake somewhere, looking at each other, saying, we have made a terrible mistake, right? But anyway, you might ask yourself, why are we even talking about this loop in the first place? Why, as we're kind of looking at this boat at the very beginning of the loop, are we even having these conversations? But I want to say that programmers get loops, right? Programmers get loops. So they're at the heart of programming, but also the heart of human experience. So I can remember when I got probably the best Christmas present that I've ever gotten. It was not the Atari version that you saw earlier. It was a Radio Shack color computer with probably the same keyboard, the same amount of frustration in the keyboard. But this was the first program that I ever wrote. A loop, right? And I see everybody nodding, saying, yeah, I wrote that program, right? And then you add a space in it and it starts to slant when it prints. And so it's not exactly what a loop looks like in Elixir. Elixir, the loop looks like this, where I take the state, and then I feed that into some type of transformation that does a little bit of work, and then I feed it right back into the same function. And it turns out that Elixir is smart enough to rewrite this to something like that, right? So my whole career has been for nothing, right? It's the same thing that I've been writing since I learned to program in the first place, right? But I want to talk about this idea of the transform. This is just another way of saying it's something that does a little bit of work. But I want to talk about the human side about that for a little bit. So there's this specialized loop in Elixir that's a process loop, right? So this process effectively says, hey, I want to do some work, and I want to do this work in a particularly reliable way, right? So this is called the Open Telecom Platform, and it's based on a language called Erlang that Elixir was then built on, right? And so the idea behind OTP is also audacious, right? It's that we're going to make mistakes. When we make mistakes, it's all good, let it die. We can start a new one, right? That's what this extraordinary reliability, maybe the most reliable language that was ever created, is based on. The idea of you can try to turn it off and turn it on again, and it mostly works, right? Okay, so this is my Elixir loop, right, with that transform state that we had in the middle last time. But OTP loop is a little bit different. An OTP loop has an interface in between, and it separates the process machinery, the part that you don't want to write, the part that has to focus on reliability and process monitoring and restarts and lifecycle management, all the hard stuff, from the custom logic in my program, right? So that's OTP. And we call this thing a gen server because it's generic. So it's an interface between the generic process machinery and the work that my program wants to do. So this is what it looks like. And in fact, you can even take out the 3 dots at the top and the 3 dots at the bottom, and this will work just fine. And what that means is use gen server is what's called a behavior. That's my contract. And then you have the whole concept of inversion of control wrapped up in that. I mean, we've seen that all over JavaScript. We've seen that in Ruby, where we don't control the controller calls, right? Ruby on Rails is going to call that. We see inversion of control in Java with the Spring platform. We see it in Django and Python, right? Inversion of control is everywhere. It's just a little bit more explicit in functional languages. Then you have a state and a transformation, just like any other loop, and you're going to run this over and over, right? But what's interesting is that functional programming languages have something called immutability, right? Once you set something in memory, you're going to maintain that same value till the end of time. So what you wind up doing is using the call stack to manage your mutability. So is that easier? I don't know. It's certainly different. But this is kind of like a transformation interface. And we saw these on the loop. So you can imagine you're on a river. The river has some gradient to it. And they normally come in the forms of things like waterfalls. Waterfalls are bad for navigation. So what you do is you build this interface on the river called a lock. So this is our second day in currently, or third day in currently, and we're pulling into a lock, and they stick us in there with this commercial vessel called, what was it, Bearcat? Is that Bearcat? Yeah. And this is us coming out of the same lock, right? We were kind of proud of not hitting any of those boats. And this is a different kind of lock, right? So in this lock, this is kind of this weird combination like a Western steampunk device that you ride into in Canada. And this is called the chute. So you're literally driving onto a train car that lifts you up and out of the water and then drops you back into the water on the other side. Here's another example of a lock. We saw this one in 2 different towns. This one is called Peterborough, that's in Canada. And there's another one that's almost like it in a town called Kirkfield. And that big black tube is a hydraulic lift. And the only thing that you need to power this thing is to put more water in the lock that's on top. And the weight of all the boats that are in the lock, that's just noise. Doesn't even matter, right? And they just open up a valve, one end goes up, one end goes down, you pull out on the other side. But the idea is that on the upstream side, in most locks, they're going to open some doors, and if I don't do anything, bad things happen, right? That's the waterfall version. In a lock, what typically happens is that I have an interface that's just an elevator full of water, right? I have doors on the top, have doors on the bottom, valve in the bottom to let the water out, valve in the top to let the water in. So I use the water to do a transformation. So I take my currently boat, let the water out of the lock, and we're all happy. Okay. So as we were on the loop, we would work on the boat. You know, some of the tasks were just like driving an RV. You have to fill it with water. You had to take waste off the boat. You had to put gas in the boat. But also, during the year, I had to maintain a full work schedule, and I did. So I would do conference calls like this one. I would write on my books, like in this one. I would work on the Groxio content. I have a training company for Elixir, and so we did our training sessions while we were on the loop. We did training videos. We wrote them on the loop. Maggie edited them. I recorded them. And so on the top of the boat, on the bottom you see our radar. On the left-hand side you see this mushroom-looking thing. That is our GPS. And then you see another antenna. That is called our PEP wave antenna. That was our internet connectivity. And so if you look at the little modem, it's just this really tiny, like a hard drive sized device. And then if you look all the way at the bottom, you see the cell SIM 1 and 2. What's cool about that is that these could be 2 different providers. Like we went with AT&T and Verizon because they were the best providers in the Southeast around the loop. And it will literally stitch the best signal together between the 2. And so we were able to keep pretty good connectivity on the loop. So I want to talk a little bit about safety on the loop because I know some people are thinking about it. We did 3 different things to stay safe. One of them was to travel with buddy boats wherever we could. Not everywhere. Some places we had to go alone, but very often you would go with a buddy boat, and if somebody got in trouble, then at least you had somebody else with a radio or to fish you out of the water, right? And then there were other times where we had to be alone, sometimes where we couldn't even see land. So the crossing is a point in time where you get to the end of the panhandle, or actually the middle of the panhandle in Florida. And if you were to continue like around this shore right here, where the top blue line is, there's too much sand, and there's especially with the storms now, you could be 2 to 10 miles offshore and have sand that's just 2 feet beneath your keel, right? So that's not a safe way to go. So most people cut across the open ocean like that. And so a lot of people ask, how did you guys stay safe? So this is one of the pictures of the crossing, or a video of the crossing. You can't see anything, right? And our weather really was that good. I mean, it was glass out there. People talk about like crossing in 4-foot waves. We didn't see anything like that. But I want to talk about the idea that after you cross that one buoy on one side and then pick up the red buoy on the other side, it's just a straight line, but that's when you're in the most peril. So what do? So it turns out that we had some things to protect us on board, like the red lights. They would maintain your night vision, right? We had lights so that other people could see us. I had to actually climb up to the top of the boat in the middle of the trip and replace the bulb that was out at one point. But you know, it's pretty smooth, so it wasn't too bad. But when we're in the middle of the Gulf, this is the literal point where I think Maggie took a picture of the GPS, or a snapshot of her phone. We're in the middle of the Gulf there, and I think we're about 50 miles from shore, 70 miles in front, 70 miles behind. But for safety, you can't make a boat sink-proof, right? There are people that have tried. So what you do instead is build small systems that are a lot like the systems that we build as software engineers. So one of them is failover, but not the way that you think, right? We didn't drag another currently. We had this little dinghy, that little raft that's on top. And this is the raft guide that lived next to us for 2 months before we left on the loop. This is when we first bought our dinghy. We had our little electric motor. He was having a great time. And then we also had the idea of notifications, right? So before you go, you say, we notified the Coast Guard and other people that kind of knew that we would be, told them where we would be, and there's a form for doing this with the Coast Guard. So we did our logging, right? There was a story that a man told us about a brand new boat with a lot of electronics on board that did this crossing, right? And he was very excited about all of his electronics. He turned everything on, right? He turned on the music, had his wife turning on the big screen TV, turned it all the way up. They had all the electronic services, whether they needed them or not. And they said, wow, isn't this great? And they burned up their alternator, and then things started to go dark. And the only thing that they could get to work was their radio. And the Coast Guard said, okay, I can hear you loud and clear. Where are you? And he said, I don't know. The Gulf of Mexico somewhere, you know? What time is it? I don't know. So the man who told us that story gave us the idea that every hour you should write down exactly where you are by looking at your GPS. And then if the Coast Guard, if you do have a conversation with the Coast Guard, you could at least tell them your speed and trajectory over time, right? So we did our logging. We also had this concept of supervision, right? And the way it works is that in OTP, we have these generic servers right? If something happens, or wait, so when we start a service, so when I start my loop, I file that float plan. The Coast Guard knows where I am, right? And so when I start my loop, if something happens, the idea is not to save the boat. The idea is to save the people so they can start a loop again at a later date, right? And so there's a philosophy that Elixir developers use called let it crash. And the idea is that you don't really care about preserving the process. You care about preserving the ideas and the user experience. You care about preserving the whole application state, right? So I have to tell a story about this. So there's a group of consultants that follow the Erlang language around and the Elixir language around. And they put on these conferences, right? And does everybody remember these conferences about the Churchill? It's like blah, 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 or keep calm and blah, 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 right? And these things were everywhere. Well, one of the first ones was for the Erlang programming language. It was keep calm and let it crash, which is cute. Unless there are 70 of you wearing that t-shirt climbing onto an airplane. They had to climb off the airplane. Then they explained to them what was going on. They all flipped their t-shirts inside out and they let it go. Okay. So, and then we looped. I wanted to kind of pull out some of the experiences that we had as we were coming up the southeastern shoreline. Where was this, Maggie? Jekyll Island. This is in Georgia. Right before we were really trying to go fast and head up while because we were running from weather and trying to get to a place where we could pick our daughter up in North Carolina. But so near this place was a place called Columbia Island. No? You had the wild horses? Cumberland Island, yes, where they had the wild horses. So this is a marina called Osprey Marina. This is in South Carolina. In North Carolina, they have this swamp called the Dismal Swamp. And it was absolutely one of the most beautiful things that we encountered on the loop. And by the way, we're writing a book about the loop, and this is going to be the cover. So in Norfolk, in Virginia, this is a ship that we saw. We're the little one. As we were in Maryland, who knows this person? Who's that? Frank Hunleth. He's the creator of the NERSC framework, and his daughter works with the mentoring program that we have. And when we got there, so Frank and Elixir were going to stay on board, and they brought this little board, right? It's a printed circuit board that had the path of the loop programmed in Phoenix's Elixir that lit up our path around the loop. It's one of the most impressive gifts I've ever gotten. It was a wonderful time. Who knows this man? Who's that? That's Brian Getz, yes. So this is the architect for the Java language. And he was in Burlington, Vermont. So I also want to talk about the idea that in the loop, we had this protocol where there are red buoys and green buoys. And the protocol was if you drive between them, mostly you stay off the bottom, right? They became our symbols of truth, right? And so there are places where it was easy to invest in the infrastructure and the buoys were right. And there were places where they just weren't. So we would be going down the river and then looking off to the right, and then washed up onto the shore, it'd be like a red buoy. Say, whoa, where was that? How did I, what would have happened if I went on the other side of wherever that one was, right? But the idea was that truth matters. And so there are a couple of things that we did to keep ourselves safe. I'm high risk, so we kept up with our vaccinations and everything. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the ideas in programming languages that can keep us safe. Right? Some of the protocols that we use in programming languages so that we know what is true when interfaces come together. So on a protocol side, in the Elixir programming language, this is our IEX console, but most languages have something like this, whether it's an abstract class or whether it's a interface in Java. But the idea is that I can inspect this, and then I can see all the information about the data type, even the protocols that are set up. Right? So that when you type 1, 2, 3 in IEX, you're going to see a result, and Elixir knows how to represent the result based on the implementation of those common ideas. Right? It's an interface. And this one, there is something analogous to a toString that's called info. That is like a toString for developers. So Elixir also has the idea of a behavior. And we talked about this concept of a gen server. Gen server is nothing but a behavior, and a behavior describes a contract. All a contract is in this instance, so that use gen server is going to establish a macro, it's going to call a macro, and that macro is going to say, hey, this is a gen server behavior, and that means that there are these specific callbacks. This contract and all of these implementation truths signify the compiler that, hey, this is part of the contract for the gen server. This is that separation that we were talking about between the process machinery and the work that manages the transformations. This is one of the things that we did to kind of track truth. And on the loop, there were places that it was incredibly important to know where the bottom was, right? So there's a captain that we spent a good amount of time with. His name was, the couple was Al and Arlene. They were on a boat called Arion. And they were old school, which means that Al would never tell me advice unless I asked him for it, right? What Al would do instead is say, hey, come aboard Arion, we're going to do some planning. And now at that point, I knew that Al had memorized all of these charts and all the places that he would go, right? And so we would come up to this table, and all the charts, all these paper charts would be there with red marks all over them. He said, see this chart, this is where we are right now. See this chart, this is where we went yesterday, this is where I'm going. And then he turns a page and turns a page and turns a page. He said, Bruce, see this chart? This is hangdog, right? We said, hangdog. Doesn't ring a bell, right? And he said, well, I tell you this because all of my sailor friends have taken this chart, they've wadded it up and thrown it away because that's not somewhere that they would ever go, right? And so one particular day, we were driving across Lake Huron. We were hearing the stories on the radio, and the stories were of boats hitting rocks and taking on water, one after another, right? And we're in this area, and we look down at the chart plotter, and I said, Maggie, where are we? She says, looks like Hangdog Channel. So, and then Maggie starts saying, hey, I see these two buoys, red and green, at 1 o'clock. I'd say, oh, 1 o'clock, there it is. So we go through them, and then she'd say, hey, come around 70 degrees or whatever. I'd come around, and she'd say, hey, 2 more buoys. You see them? Okay, I got the red. And then we pass on the right side, and this way, we made it all the way through, right? Because Canada had invested in infrastructure in the right way, and those buoys were bang on. And the ones that were missing, we would see painted milk cartons floating up that were marking the places until the Coast Guard could mark them again. It was really, really amazing. How are we doing here? So we looped. This was also in the Dismal Swamp. You can see the coffee color in the water. Right, that's rot. So this is New York. And this particular day, I was promoted to head photographer. Not really. What really happened was we came into town, and in New York City, there are all these ferries that are always shooting through really quickly. And they don't really care about you, right? I mean, they're gonna go where they're gonna go. They don't look, they throw off these huge wakes, really scary. And there are literally dozens of them operating at once. So you don't know where any one of them is gonna go. And we got there at the same time as this parade of boats at a time called Fleet Week, right? So there are battleships, aircraft carriers, there's a Coast Guard vessel. And so we get here, and all those ferries that have access to 100% of the river most days of the Hudson, they took 80% of it. And so all those ferries and Little Currently were in this tiny little 20% section, and I crawled into a fetal position and laid in the aisle, and Maggie brings me the camera and says, hey, why don't you go take some pictures of our friends? They're about to get to the Statue of Liberty. And so Maggie drove that part. I'm not proud of it, but she did great. So this was a place in Canada, the seat of power. This is Ottawa. And these are 8 locks chained back to back to back. And so this was our best day on the loop. So you would go through that first lock chamber, the doors on the bottom, and then the Canada staff, I mean, we felt like they were pranking us or something, right? Because we would pull into these locks and they would lower these ropes that were pristine and white instead of like green and slimy, and they would like touch your hand and you'd say, oh, and so you're, I mean, it was just so impossibly nice. And as you're climbing, there are people that are, chatting you up and having a good time. It was really a fantastic experience. And there's all of this Gothic and Victorian architecture around you. Like the hotel on your left, there's Parliament on the right. It was really an amazing experience. So you could see some of the people on the bottom. Some of our friends, the same ones that followed us into New York, later, they met somebody on the bottom and said, hey, why don't you come up through the locks with us? So they went up through the locks with a local Canadian couple, and I thought that was the coolest thing. So this is, let me just go through. The whole idea is that programmers get loops. We know, right? We know that you start somewhere. We know that there are iterations, and with every stop, there's a little bit of a transformation that takes place. We know that sometimes those transformations come in expected ways, and sometimes unexpected. We know that sometimes loops run in isolation, sometimes concurrently, but we watch. Sometimes we have to wait. until we come home, transformed in exactly the right way. Stay true. Be curious. Dream big and loud. And change.